The fate of a $200 million empire didn't hinge on the billionaire's gilded pen or the investor's shrewd calculations. It rested on a whisper from a waitress whose existence was as disposable as a used napkin. In the hushed, mahogany-paneled, sovereign room of the Obsidian Club, billionaire Julian Croft, a man forged in the crucible of Wall Street's unforgiving mathematics, prepared to sign the deal that would launch his most audacious venture yet. At that precise, suspended moment, a voice, soft yet with the unnerving clarity of a breaking point, sliced through the air thick with the scent of leather and old money. "Sir, your risk model is flawed." The whisper that would either shatter a young woman's life into 1,000 pieces or save a titan from his own blind spot. For Clara Reed, however, it was more than a correction. It was the moment the ghost of the woman she was supposed to be rose up to confront the woman she had become. And in that collision, the future of high finance was about to be rewritten. The Obsidian Club wasn't a restaurant, it was a fortress of power. Each night, behind its soundproofed doors, the fate of corporations was decided over dry-aged steaks and glasses of scotch that cost more than Clara's monthly rent. Her role in this theatre of ambition was brutally simple. Be a phantom, refill water, clear plates, and hear nothing. Tonight, the starched collar of her uniform felt like a noose. At 26, Clara wore the bone-deep weariness of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. Her eyes, a startling shade of grey that once devoured complex theorems, were now clouded by the exhaustion of back-to-back shifts and the relentless anxiety of a debt that breathed down her neck. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt, a black vest and trousers, was a shroud for the person she had buried. A doctoral candidate in quantitative finance at MIT, a prodigy whose mind could waltz through the most esoteric algorithms, a name once whispered with reverence in the halls of the mathematics department. That life had detonated 4 years ago. A single sterile phone call about her father's fatal heart attack, a consequence of the stress from losing his life savings in the 2008 crash, had been the first domino. The second was her mother's subsequent diagnosis, a rare, aggressive form of multiple sclerosis, requiring treatments that insurance companies deemed experimental, and therefore a financial black hole. Clara dropped out of her PhD program, trading the clean, abstract world of stochastic calculus for the messy, brutal reality of medical bills and caregiving. The crushing debt, a monument to her love and her loss, had pushed her into the shadows of the service industry, the only place offering cash payments and the flexibility a caregiver desperately needed. "Reed, Table 3 wants another bottle of the Macallan 25. "Now," barked Mr. Gable, the restaurant's manager, a man whose own failed ambitions had metastasized into a petty, simmering cruelty. He seemed to derive a particular pleasure from reminding Clara of her fall from grace, having once seen her MIT student ID when she'd first applied. "This isn't a university library. Stop staring into space and move." Clara's face became a placid mask of obedience. "Yes, Mr. Gable." She moved with a fluid economy of motion, her worn but impeccably polished shoes silent on the Persian rugs. She poured the scotch, her senses operating on a level most people never accessed. To survive at the Obsidian Club, you had to be more than a server. You had to be a ghost who saw everything. You learned to read the almost imperceptible tightening of a jaw, the subtle shift in posture that signaled a deal was souring, the flicker of an eye that betrayed a lie. Tonight, the atmosphere in the sovereign room was not just charged, it was radioactive. It was the club's inner sanctum, reserved for the gods of finance. And tonight's Zeus was Julian Croft, the founder and CEO of Croft Axiom, a quantitative hedge fund that was more of a technological weapon than a financial firm. Clara knew the name. The entire financial world genuflected to it. He was a ruthless genius, a former MIT quant himself, who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on algorithms so complex they were said to be sentient. He was legendarily impatient, brutally demanding, and possessed a mind that moved at the speed of light. Serving his table was like performing brain surgery on a moving train. As she entered the sovereign room with a tray of fresh crystal glasses, the weight of the meeting pressed down on her. Croft was not alone. With him was his executive vice president, Bryce Calloway, a man whose ambition was so naked it was practically a second suit. He was handsome, slick, and possessed the easy charm of a predator who knew how to make his prey feel comfortable. Across the vast oak table sat Alistair Finch, the patriarch of a Swiss banking dynasty. Finch was old money personified, impeccably dressed, with a face as still and deep as a mountain lake, and eyes that had assessed the character of kings and charlatans. This was not a dinner. This was an audition, a $200 million one. Clara's mind, the part she fought to keep numb during her shifts, began to stir. Croft Axiom was launching a new, fully automated AI trading fund. Finch's firm was the potential anchor investor, the colossal injection of capital, and, more importantly, credibility that would make it the most powerful financial instrument on the planet. She moved around the table, a silent, efficient spectre. Her focus was on the task, but her ears, trained by years of academic lectures, couldn't help but snag on the fragments of conversation. Words like volatility arbitrage, machine learning, alpha decay, and tail risk hedging. They were echoes from a dead language she still spoke fluently, ghosts of a life she had been forced to abandon. A sharp, bitter ache bloomed in her chest. She forced it down, burying it under the immediate, desperate need to survive the next 3 hours. She set the last glass down, and as she turned to leave, Julian Croft's voice, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, stopped her dead. "Waitress." She froze, turning back with practiced deference. "Sir." He didn't look at her. His gaze was locked on Alistair Finch. "The wine. We'll have the 82 Petrus, and I don't want to be disturbed again unless the building is on fire." It was a command wrapped in a dismissal, a clear and brutal reinforcement of her utter irrelevance. "Of course, sir," she murmured, her voice a perfect, neutral whisper. As she walked from the room, her cloak of invisibility wrapped tightly around her. She had no idea that in less than an hour she would be forced to set that cloak ablaze. She would have to risk everything she had, which was next to nothing, on the ghost of the mathematician she used to be. The weight of the tray in her hands was nothing compared to the weight of the truth she was about to uncover. The 1982 Chateau Petrus was housed in the deep cellar, a temperature-controlled sanctuary where liquid fortunes slept, their value compounding with every silent second. Retrieving the bottle gave Clara a few precious minutes of reprieve from the suffocating pressure of the sovereign room. As she handled the bottle with the care of a librarian handling a first folio Shakespeare, she felt the crushing weight of its $60,000 price tag. It was more than she had earned in the last 2 years combined. The sheer, grotesque absurdity of it, all this casual, obscene wealth just a few feet from her own desperate hand-to-mouth existence, was a familiar, choking poison. Returning to the room, she performed the sommelier's ritual of presentation and decanting with a flawless, detached precision. Julian Croft gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. His attention already snapped back to the main event. He was a man who seemed carved from obsidian and sheer willpower. His dark hair streaked with a distinguished silver at the temples, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to analyze rather than see. He radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable control, a man so accustomed to bending reality to his will that the possibility of being wrong had simply ceased to exist in his universe. His EVP, Bryce Calloway, was a study in contrasts. Where Croft was a block of granite, Calloway was mercury, fluid, slick, and adaptable. He laughed a fraction too loudly at Croft's bone-dry witticisms and leaned forward with a sycophantic eagerness that set Clara's teeth on edge. He was a corporate chameleon, and tonight he was performing the role of his life. But the true gravitational center of the room, Clara sensed, was the silent man across the table. Alistair Finch listened. He absorbed every word, every gesture, his stillness a form of active analysis. His younger associate tapped away silently on a laptop, but Finch's eyes missed nothing. "The potential here is not merely generational wealth, Alistair," Croft was saying, his voice a low, persuasive hum. He had already shifted to a first-name basis, a subtle assertion of dominance. "This is about creating a new paradigm. Prometheus isn't just an algorithm. It's a self-correcting financial intelligence. It will redefine the very concept of market risk." Clara's ears pricked up. Market risk. Her doctoral thesis had been on modeling extreme tail risk events, the so-called black swans that traditional financial models dismissed as impossible outliers. She had spent 4 years of her life wrestling with the very demons Croft axiom now claimed to have chained. A phantom limb of her mind twitched, the old familiar urge to grab a whiteboard and map out probability distributions. She suppressed it, focusing on clearing the bread plates. "Your claims are bold, Julian," Alistair Finch said, his English precise and tinged with a faint Swiss-German accent. "Many have tried to solve the market. Their hubris now lines the bottom of Wall Street's graveyard." "And that," Bryce Calloway interjected, seizing his moment to shine, "is because they were using outdated models. They were driving with a rear-view mirror." He slid a slim, glowing tablet across the polished table. "Prometheus doesn't just analyze past data. It stress tests against millions of simulated future scenarios in real time. The key is our proprietary volatility decay coefficient." Calloway tapped the screen, and a complex equation bloomed to life. It was a beautiful, terrifying string of Greek letters, integrals and subscripts. To the others it was an abstract symbol of genius. To Clara it was a sentence in her native tongue. Alistair Finch leaned forward, his shrewd eyes narrowing as he studied the equation. "Impressive. And you're back-testing against the 2008 crisis?" "Flawless," Calloway said, his voice swelling with a salesman's pride. "Prometheus didn't just survive 2008. It generated a 40% alpha. It saw the collapse coming and hedged perfectly. This equation is the heart of the entire $200 million valuation for this partnership." Julian Croft watched Finch's reaction, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. He was the master conductor, letting his first violin play the solo while he controlled the entire orchestra. He swirled the deep crimson wine in his glass, the very picture of absolute confidence. He was about to secure his legacy. Clara moved to refill Alistair Finch's water glass, her path taking her directly behind Bryce Calloway. For a fleeting, fatal moment, her gaze fell on the tablet screen. She saw the elegant flow of the algorithm, the notation for the machine learning loops, the specific variables in the volatility decay coefficient. She saw it all, and then she saw it. The whole. The beautiful, fatal flaw. It was an assumption, a single, elegant, and utterly wrong assumption, buried deep in the fine print of the math. The algorithm treated extreme volatility spikes as mean reverting. It assumed that after a catastrophic market shock, a true black swan event, volatility would quickly and predictably return to the mean. It was a common, lazy assumption made by 100 failed hedge funds. It worked perfectly in 99.9% of simulations. But in the 0.1%, in the face of a true systemic collapse, a Lehman Brothers level event where panic feeds on itself, the model would fail. It wouldn't just fail, it would turn on itself. It would interpret the sustained, extreme volatility as a buying signal, leveraging up and doubling down into a market that was in total freefall. It was a financial suicide machine. A jolt, colder and more terrifying than any physical shock, shot through Clara's body. Her breath caught in her lungs. The world around her seemed to warp and slow, the confident drone of Bryce Calloway's voice fading into a distant, meaningless buzz. All she could see was that glowing screen, the flawed equation burning itself into the back of her retinas. Her mind flashed back to a late-night session in a sterile MIT computer lab. She could almost smell the stale coffee and the hum of the servers. She remembered Professor Anya Sharma, her mentor, a woman with a mind like a diamond, pointing to a nearly identical flaw in Clara's own early work. "The math is beautiful, Clara," she had said, her pen striking through the offending line of code. "But you have forgotten that markets are not pure math. They are math wrapped in human fear. And in a true panic, fear is the only variable that matters." This was worse than an academic error. This was a flaw at the very core of a $200 million deal. A flaw that could not only vaporize Alastair Finch's investment, but could potentially trigger a wider market panic when it inevitably imploded. Croft Axiom would be obliterated. Panic and adrenaline waged a war inside her. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to do nothing. Say nothing. It wasn't her world anymore. She was a waitress, a ghost. If she spoke up, she wouldn't just be fired. She would be humiliated, cast out, and likely blacklisted by Mr. Gable. She could vividly picture the scene, the powerful men staring at her with utter contempt, Bryce Calloway with a look of smug victory, Julian Croft with an arctic rage that could freeze fire. "Keep your head down, finish the shift, go home to your mother, and forget you saw a thing." She retreated from the table, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the water pitcher with both hands. She stood by the service station in the corner, trying to force air into her constricted lungs, but she couldn't tear her eyes from them. She watched Alastair Finch nod slowly, a look of genuine, impressed satisfaction settling on his features. He exchanged a glance with his associate. This was it. They were sold. "This is most compelling, Julian," Finch said, a rare note of warmth entering his voice. "My team has reviewed the preliminary data, and this final piece aligns with our own risk assessments. We are prepared to move forward." He reached into his fine leather briefcase and produced a heavy, blue folder. The contract. The sight of that folder was like a physical blow. The finality of it. They were going to sign. They were going to build a financial weapon of mass destruction on a foundation of sand, on an algorithm that was a ticking time bomb. Clara's conscience screamed. This wasn't just about money. It was about intellectual honesty. It was about the truth. It was about the memory of her father, a good man ruined by the careless arrogance of financiers who thought they were smarter than the storm. The work she had dedicated her life to was being perverted by a slick, careless salesman like Bryce Calloway, who had clearly taken a shortcut to impress his boss. Her years of sacrifice, her mother's belief in her, the ghost of Professor Sharma. It all felt like a bitter joke if she stood by and let this happen. Julian Croft was already retrieving his pen, a magnificent platinum instrument. Mr. Finch opened the folder. The room fell silent, thick with the weight of a historic moment. Clara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every cell in her body screamed for self-preservation, for the safety of invisibility. But the ghost of the mathematician she once was, the woman who believed that truth was not a variable but an axiom, refused to stay buried. She had already lost her career, her future, her father. She had nothing left to lose but a dead-end job that was slowly killing her soul. And in that moment, that no longer seemed like a fair trade. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she pushed off from the wall. She began to walk toward the table, each step an act of rebellion against the life that had been forced upon her. She had no plan, no eloquent speech prepared. She only knew she could not let that pen touch that paper. The world shrank to the few yards of plush carpet between her and the table. To the men seated there, her approach was a non-event, the waitress returning for some menial task. They didn't even look up. Their universe was contained in the crisp pages of the contract and the gleaming nib of Julian Croft's pen. Clara's mind was a maelstrom. "What are you doing? Turn back. This is professional suicide. He will ruin you." The voice of fear was loud and rational, but beneath it, another voice, quieter and harder than steel, spoke with the authority of a mathematical proof. Fear is the only variable that matters. She reached the table just as Croft uncapped his pen. The soft click echoed in the silence like a judge's gavel. Time was up. There was no elegant way to do this. She defaulted to the only role she was permitted in this room, the deferential servant. Leaning in toward Julian Croft, she lowered her head as if to ask about the service, bringing her mouth close to his ear. Her movements were a perfect imitation of a well-trained waitress, utterly non-threatening. Croft, annoyed by the interruption at this critical second, began to turn his head, a scowl already forming. He expected a question about coffee or dessert. Instead, she spoke 6 words. Her voice was a barely audible whisper, yet each syllable was delivered with the unwavering certainty of a proven theorem. "Sir, your risk model is flawed." The whisper was so quiet only he could have heard it. For a single, eternal second, the universe held its breath. Julian Croft froze. His pen hovered a centimeter above the signature line. His brain, a quantum computer accustomed to processing trillions of bytes of market data, failed to categorize this impossible, insane input. A waitress, a risk model. He turned his head slowly, his piercing blue eyes finally, truly focusing on her for the first time all night. He no longer saw a uniform. He saw a young woman with an expression of such intense, desperate conviction that it momentarily short-circuited his fury. He saw grey eyes that held a startling, unnerving fire of intelligence. But the moment of shock quickly curdled into a cold, lethal rage. Who was this person? How dare she? The sheer, astronomical audacity of it was breathtaking. "What did you just say?" he breathed back, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Clara didn't flinch. She had already jumped off the cliff. There was no going back. "The volatility decay coefficient," she whispered, her gaze flicking toward the tablet Calloway was now smugly powering down. "It misinterprets tail risk. It will amplify losses in a black swan event." Across the table, Alistair Finch, ever the observer, noticed the exchange. He saw Croft's frozen posture, the waitress whispering urgently in his ear, the inexplicable halt to the proceedings. He raised a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Bryce Calloway noticed, too. A sneer of contempt twisted his lips. He saw a lowly waitress overstepping her bounds, about to be vaporized by his boss. He almost found it amusing. Croft's face was a thundercloud. This was his coronation, the culmination of years of work, and some menial insect was attempting to sabotage it with technical-sounding gibberish. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. His entire being screamed at him to have her dragged out, to make an example of her that would be spoken of for years. He opened his mouth to utter the two words that would end her life as she knew it. But something stopped him. It was the look in her eyes. It wasn't insanity. It wasn't a pathetic plea for attention. It was certainty. A terrifying, absolute certainty that he, in his entire career, had only ever seen in the eyes of fellow Fields medal-level mathematicians and Nobel laureates. And it was coming from a waitress. The cognitive dissonance was so profound, so jarring, that it created a hairline fracture in the foundation of his rage. But it was a very, very small fracture. Julian Croft's fury, held in check for that one bewildering moment, finally erupted. It wasn't a shout. He was far too controlled for such a vulgar display. It was a cold, focused implosion of wrath. He pulled back from Clara, his eyes turning to chips of blue ice. "Get out!" He bit off each word, lacing them with enough venom to dissolve concrete. He didn't raise his voice, but the command carried the absolute, crushing weight of a man who had never once in his adult life been disobeyed. It was an order of social and professional annihilation. Bryce Calloway's sneer widened into a triumphant grin. He leaned back, ready to enjoy the execution. Alistair Finch watched the scene unfold with the detached curiosity of a grandmaster watching a novice blunder. Clara's blood ran cold. The dismissal hit her like a physical punch. This was it, the moment she had dreaded. She had failed. She had gambled everything and lost in the space of 10 seconds. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over her. But as she straightened up, pulling away from the table, her gaze met Bryce Calloway's. She saw the undisguised reptilian pleasure on his face, the look of a man who relished seeing others crushed. And in that instant, her fear was incinerated by a different, purer fire. It wasn't just about the math anymore. It was about the arrogance, the smug, careless incompetence of men like Calloway, who could ruin lives, her father's life, and companies with their shortcuts, and never once face the consequences. She could not leave. Not like this. Ignoring Croft's command, she turned to the sommelier's station. With a swift, deliberate motion, she picked up a pristine, white tasting card and the silver pen that lay beside it. As Croft turned back to Alistair Finch, a forced, brittle smile plastered on his face to smooth over the unprecedented disruption. "My sincerest apologies, Alistair. A disgruntled staff member," Clara acted. On the clean surface of the card, her hand moved with a speed and precision that defied her trembling body. She didn't write a plea. She wrote a prophecy. She scribbled the core of the flawed coefficient. Beneath it, she wrote a single damning line of code. If VIX 40 and DVDT 0. Execute by max leverage. It was a kill switch, a line of logic that would bankrupt the fund in a market crash. Beneath that, she wrote 4 words. Black Swan event. Total ruin. It was a diagnosis and a death sentence. She strode back to the table. The men watched, stunned into a fresh silence by her sheer, unbelievable audacity. She didn't say another word. She simply placed the tasting card on the polished mahogany, directly in Julian Croft's line of sight, next to the open contract. Then she turned and walked out of the sovereign room, her back ramrod straight, her head held high. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She walked with the quiet, terrible dignity of someone who had said what needed to be said and was ready for the sky to fall. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, the spell was broken. "Unbelievable!" Bryce Calloway sputtered, his face crimson with indignation. "Julian, I am so sorry. I'll have security deal with her immediately. She's clearly insane." But Julian Croft wasn't listening. His gaze was riveted to the sommelier's card, to the frantic, yet terrifyingly precise, scroll of an equation and a line of code. A line of code that looked chillingly plausible. A line of code that, if true, represented a catastrophic failure of his entire organization. Alistair Finch leaned forward, his curiosity now fully ignited. This was no longer a minor staff issue. This was a new, unknown variable injected into a meticulously calculated equation. And Alistair Finch didn't invest in unknown variables. "Julian," he said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes on the card. "Perhaps you should look at what she wrote." The deal was no longer moving. The platinum pen was capped. The contract lay unsigned. The entire $200 million venture now teetered on the edge of a razor, its fate resting on the scribbles on a small piece of cardstock. The atmosphere in the sovereign room had been irrevocably contaminated. The smooth, celebratory momentum was dead, replaced by a tense, vibrating silence. Bryce Calloway was fuming. Alistair Finch was observing. And Julian Croft was staring at the tasting card, as if it were a declaration of war. "Julian, this is absurd," Calloway insisted, his voice tight with rising panic. "Are we really going to allow some psychotic waitress to derail this entire negotiation? I'm calling security." "Shut up, Bryce," Croft said, his voice dangerously quiet. He didn't look up from the card. The seed of doubt the waitress had planted with her eyes had been fertilized by the ink on the card. "If Vixt 40 and David Titu Caesaris Dero." It was specific. It was a testable hypothesis. It was not the babbling of a lunatic. Julian Croft was a billionaire not because he was a good salesman, but because he was a pathologically paranoid mathematician who trusted the numbers above all else. He trusted his gut only when it told him the numbers were lying. And right now, his gut was screaming that he had been lied to. He had built his empire by questioning every assumption, especially when a result looked too good to be true. And Calloway's presentation tonight had been just a little too polished, a little too perfect. He picked up the card. He looked at the line of code, then glanced at Calloway. "Bryce, show me the raw back-testing data for the 87 and 2008 crash simulations. Not the summary report, the raw tick data output." Calloway went pale. The raw data, Julian? It's all summarized in the presentation deck. We passed with flying colors. "That is not what I asked," Croft said, his blue eyes narrowing to slits. "I want to see the source code for the tail risk hedging module and the raw simulation output. Now." Alistair Finch watched this exchange, his impassive face a perfect mask, but he subtly pushed the contract folder back toward the center of the table. The signing was officially, indefinitely, on hold. They're on the secure servers back at the office," Calloway stammered, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "I can have my assistant send them over, but it'll take some time to access the archives." "Don't bother." Croft stood up abruptly, his movement so sudden it made Calloway flinch. "Gentlemen, please excuse us for a moment. An internal matter requires my immediate attention." He grabbed Bryce Calloway by the upper arm, his grip like a vice. "You, with me." He all but dragged his EVP out of the dining room and into a small adjacent study used for private calls, slamming the door behind them. The soundproofed room, lined with antique books he'd never read, suddenly felt like an interrogation cell. "Do not lie to me, Bryce," Croft said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He released Calloway's arm, and the younger man stumbled back against a desk. "Did you run the deep state volatility simulations yourself, or did you have the junior quants do it?" "I supervised the entire process, Julian, I swear," Calloway insisted, his bravado dissolving like sugar in water. "The data is solid." Croft ignored him. He pulled his own encrypted laptop from his briefcase, a sleek carbon fiber machine, and set it on the desk. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a speed that betrayed his origins as a coder. He wasn't just a CEO, he was the architect of the entire system. "I'm pulling the commit logs from the central code repository myself," Croft said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Every line of code, every change, every simulation parameter. If you cut a corner, Bryce, I will find it." Calloway watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't cut corners, not really. He had trusted the initial positive results. In his burning ambition to finalize the presentation for Finch, he had assigned the final, most tedious battery of black swan stress tests to a new hire, a brilliant but inexperienced kid straight out of Carnegie Mellon. He had only glanced at the executive summary the kid had written, which had been glowing. He never checked the raw output logs himself. It was a minor, insignificant oversight, born of a crushing deadline. It couldn't possibly matter. Croft found the project files. He brought up the source code for the Prometheus algorithm. His eyes scanned the millions of lines of code, his brain processing the logic with terrifying speed. He found the tail risk module. He saw the name of the junior quant in the commit log. And then he saw the comment Calloway had left in the project management ticket. "Focus on standard deviation events. Extreme tail risk sims are low priority for this deadline. Generate summary for deck ASAP." A cold dread washed over Croft. He didn't run the original simulation again. Instead, with a grim surgical precision, he wrote a new one. He configured the simulation to replicate the exact market conditions of October 19th, 1987, Black Monday. He keyed in the logic from the Waitress's card, setting a simple instruction. If the VIX, the market's fear index, spiked above 40 while still accelerating, the algorithm was to use maximum leverage to buy into the dip, assuming a rapid reversion. Then he hit Enter. The simulation began. Lines of data scrolled down the screen. Graphs began to form. For the first few virtual hours of the trading day, everything looked stable. Calloway began to breathe a tentative sigh of relief. And then it happened. The virtual market gapped down. The VIX on the screen exploded, screaming past 40. The line on the fund's performance graph, which had been holding steady, suddenly took a catastrophic nosedive. A cascade of red warning notifications flooded the screen. Margin call failed. Liquidity event triggered. Error. Catastrophic loss exceeds fund value. Simulation terminated. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the laptop's fan. The screen glowed with the stark, brutal evidence of their near apocalypse. The algorithm didn't just lose money. It had become a weapon pointed at their own head, leveraging up to catch a falling knife and getting dismembered in the process. The Waitress had been right. Julian Croft stared at the screen, at the glowing red text that spelled out the death of his legacy. He felt a wave of ice-cold dread, followed immediately by a surge of white-hot volcanic fury. He had come within a single pen stroke of betting his company, his reputation, and $200 million of Alistair Finch's money on a lie. An unintentional lie, perhaps, born of incompetence and ambition, but a lie that would have utterly destroyed him. He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling on Bryce Calloway. Calloway looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was ashen, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The slick, confident veneer had been sandblasted away, leaving only a terrified, hollowed-out man who had committed the one unforgivable sin in Croft's world. He had been stupid. "Bryce," Croft said, and his voice was terrifyingly calm, the eerie quiet in the eye of a hurricane. "You didn't check the junior's work, did you?" Calloway couldn't speak. He just shook his head, a pathetic, jerky motion. "You saw the green lights on the summary report and you rushed it," Croft continued, piecing together the cheap, sordid story. "You wanted the glory for closing this deal so badly, you skipped the most critical verification stage. You took a shortcut and presented it as gospel. Julian, I swear I didn't know," Calloway whispered, his voice cracking. "It was a small oversight, an honest mistake." "An honest mistake?" Croft's voice finally rose, the calm shattering into 1,000 sharp edges. "An honest mistake that would have vaporized this entire firm. An honest mistake that would have made the name Croft Axiom a synonym for catastrophe. You didn't just fail me, you fool. You almost took down everything I have ever built." He gestured wildly at the laptop. "And the truth, the actual, ground-level truth was handed to me on a goddamn tasting card by a waitress you wouldn't have pissed on if she was on fire." The sheer, staggering, cosmic irony of it hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. He had been saved. Saved from his own hubris, from his deputy's lethal incompetence, by the most unlikely, invisible person in the universe. He felt a bizarre, disorienting mix of profound relief and profound humiliation. Without another word to the now sobbing Calloway, he turned and walked back into the sovereign room. His entire demeanor had shifted. The rage was still there, a white-hot coal in his gut, but it was now overlaid with a grim, focused clarity. Alistair Finch and his associate looked up as he entered. "My sincerest apologies for the delay, Alistair," Julian said, his voice steady and controlled. He walked to the table and picked up the tablet Calloway had left behind. "There appears to have been a significant oversight in our final stress testing protocols." He reactivated the screen, deleted the flawed equation with a vicious swipe of his finger. "My vice president, in his enthusiasm to present a flawless result, relied on a summary report that contained a critical error." Croft lied smoothly, sacrificing Calloway without a moment's hesitation. "The core logic is sound, but the tail risk module requires a complete overhaul. The version you saw is not safe. It is not viable." Alistair Finch listened, his expression unchanging. He was no mathematician, but he understood courage, and he understood integrity. He glanced toward the study door, where Bryce Calloway was presumably having his career dismantled. He had not just seen a successful pitch fail, he had seen a CEO identify a fatal flaw under extreme pressure, take immediate ownership of it, and transparently declare it to his primary investor, effectively killing his own deal. In Finch's world, that was infinitely more valuable than 1,000 perfect presentations. It showed character. It showed resilience. "A fortunate discovery, Julian," Finch said, his tone neutral, but a new, deeper level of respect had entered his eyes. "Indeed," Croft said grimly. "Fortunate." He looked at the unsigned contract, then at Finch. "The deal as it stands is off the table. I will not sell you a flawed product." Alistair Finch held his gaze for a long, silent moment. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Rebuild the model. Fix the flaw. When you are certain it is perfect, call me. My offer will still stand." The deal was not dead. It was reborn, forged in a crucible of newfound honesty. But for Julian Croft, the night's work was far from over. As Finch and his associate prepared to leave, Julian's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about a cheap tasting card, a line of code, and a pair of intelligent grey eyes that had seen the truth when everyone else, including himself, was blind. He had to find that waitress. While fortunes were being salvaged and careers incinerated, Clara Reed was in the sterile, fluorescent-lit staff locker room, changing out of her uniform. Her hand still trembled, but her mind was strangely, blessedly quiet. She had done it. The consequences were no longer in her control. She fully expected the door to burst open at any second, for security guards to flank a purple-faced Mr. Gable, who would scream at her that she would never work in this city again. She methodically folded her vest and placed it in her locker, bracing for the inevitable collision. The door opened. Clara looked up, her heart seizing in her chest. But it wasn't security. It wasn't Mr. Gable. It was Julian Croft. He stood in the doorway of the cramped, dingy locker room, a man who belonged on the cover of Forbes, looking utterly alien amidst the rows of dented metal and the smell of bleach. He had dismissed Bryce Calloway with a single, career-ending sentence, "You're done," and had left the final pleasantries with Finch to his legal team. His only priority was finding her. Clara stood frozen, her worn backpack clutched in her hand. For a long, silent moment, neither of them spoke. The air crackled with unspoken histories and unimaginable futures. Croft's expression was a complex, unreadable tapestry of gratitude, curiosity, and sheer, thunderstruck disbelief. He finally broke the silence. His voice, stripped of its earlier fury, was raw and direct. "They're going to be writing case studies about you at Harvard Business School one day," he said. "And no one will ever know it was you." Clara swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "Is the deal?" "The deal is on hold," he confirmed, "because of you. You didn't just save Alistair Finch $200 million. You saved my company. You saved my entire legacy from becoming a footnote in a book about financial disasters." He took a step into the room. "I have to ask, how in God's name did you know?" The question hung in the air. This was it. The moment to tell the truth. The dam of secrets she had maintained for 4 long, brutal years, finally shattered. I am a quantitative analyst," she said, her voice quiet but clear, gaining strength with each word. "I was in the PhD program at MIT. My thesis was on modeling systemic risk in high-volatility environments. The assumption your model made, about mean reversion in a panic, it was a classic error. I made it myself in my second year. Professor Sharma ripped my paper to shreds for it. I never forgot the lesson." Croft's eyes widened. It all clicked into place with the force of a tectonic shift, the confidence, the precision, the impossible, esoteric knowledge. It wasn't a lucky guess, it was expertise. "MIT," he breathed, a new, profound level of respect in his voice. He had recruited from that very program. "What happened? Why are you here?" Clara looked away, the raw, familiar pain welling up. "My father died. The stress of the 2008 crash. Then my mother got sick. The medical bills. I had to drop out. I had to pay them." The simple, brutal calculus of her life was all the explanation needed. Julian Croft, a man who navigated the merciless world of high-frequency trading and corporate takeovers, was silenced by the stark, terrible reality of her sacrifice. He saw the ghost of the brilliant mathematician standing before him in a cheap t-shirt and worn-out sneakers, holding a backpack filled with shattered dreams. He saw a mind that his company desperately needed, a mind that was currently polishing silver and clearing away half-eaten food. The sheer, wasteful absurdity of it was overwhelming. He had spent millions on headhunters to find talent, half as good as the woman standing right in front of him. He knew what he had to do. This was not about a reward. A check would be a profound insult to what she had done, to who she was. This was about correcting a catastrophic error in the universe's accounting. "I'm not going to offer you money, Miss Reed," he said, his voice firm. "Money can't fix this. I'm going to offer you a job." Clara looked up, stunned. "A job?" "Not as a waitress in my corporate cafeteria," he said, a faint wry smile touching his lips for the first time. "As a special analyst. You'll work with me, directly. Your only job will be to do what you did tonight, to look at our models, our strategies, our entire system, and find the flaws. You will be my professional skeptic, my red team of one. You won't be working for my quants. They'll be working to impress you." Clara stared at him, speechless. It was an impossible, fantastical offer, a dream plucked from a life she had long since buried and mourned. Her mind, so quick with equations, could not process the variables of this new reality. I don't have a degree," she stammered. "I dropped out." "You have something more valuable than a piece of paper," Croft countered, his gaze intense. "You have integrity, and you have been tested by fire in a way none of my PhDs ever have. Tonight, you proved that. The job is yours if you want it. Your real life. The one you were meant to have." He held out his hand. "Don't let a fool like Bryce Calloway be the end of your story. Let him be the beginning." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a profound, earth-shattering relief. The crushing weight she had carried for 4 years, the leaden cloak of failure and regret, began to dissolve. In that grimy, fluorescent-lit locker room, surrounded by the ghosts of her hardship, Clara Reed reached out and took Julian Croft's hand. She was done being invisible. 6 months later, the scent of whiteboard markers and ozone had replaced the lingering aromas of aged beef and expensive scotch in Clara Reed's life. Her world was no longer defined by the 4 corners of a serving tray, but by the infinite possibilities contained within the algorithms that powered Croft Axiom. The sharp, tailored blazer she now wore felt more natural than the starched vest ever had. It was not a costume. It was her armor. Croft had been better than his word. Her transition wasn't instantaneous or magical. The first few weeks were brutal. The existing quant team, many of whom had been friends with Bryce Calloway, treated her with a mixture of suspicion and outright hostility. They saw her as an interloper, a freakish anomaly, the waitress who had somehow bewitched the boss. They subjected her to a gauntlet of informal tests, peppering her with obscure mathematical problems and trying to trip her up in meetings. It didn't work. Clara, quiet and unassuming, met their intellectual machismo not with aggression, but with irrefutable logic. She didn't tell them she was smart, she showed them. The turning point came during a crisis when a new European bond trading algorithm went haywire. The team worked for 36 hours straight, unable to find the bug. Clara, after quietly observing for an hour, walked up to the main screen and pointed to a single line of code. "The error is not in the trading logic," she said softly. "It's in the data parser. You're misinterpreting the timestamp format from the Frankfurt exchange by 50 milliseconds. You're trading on ghosts." She was right. The silence in the room was deafening. From that day on, the hostility evaporated, replaced by a grudging, and then a genuine respect. Her relationship with Julian Croft had evolved into a unique partnership. He was her boss, but also her sponsor and intellectual sparring partner. They would spend hours in his glass-walled office, filling massive whiteboards with equations, arguing passionately about market volatility and the philosophical implications of artificial intelligence. He saw in her a purity of purpose, a love for the mathematical truth that he himself had lost somewhere on the climb to becoming a billionaire. She saw in him a visionary who could give her abstract ideals the power to reshape the world. With her first substantial paycheck, she had paid off every last cent of her mother's medical debt. She hired the best full-time caregiver and moved her mother into a bright, beautiful apartment with a garden. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her shadow for years was gone, replaced by the thrilling, high-wire hum of intellectual challenge. One afternoon, Julian called her into his office. He looked grim. Finch called. He's getting impatient. Rebuilding the Prometheus model from scratch is taking too long. He's starting to listen to offers from our competitors. The old Clara would have been paralyzed by the pressure. The new Clara saw an equation that needed to be solved. She didn't just want to patch the old model. She wanted to build something fundamentally different. She locked herself in her office for the next 72 hours, fueled by coffee and a cold, burning determination. She filled whiteboard after whiteboard, not with trading algorithms, but with models of human psychology, of herd behavior and panic. She was trying to quantify fear itself. On the third day, she emerged, exhausted but electric. She called Julian to her office. On the central whiteboard was a new system architecture. "We've been thinking about the problem all wrong," she explained, her voice hoarse but alive with passion. "Prometheus was designed to predict the market. That's impossible. It's hubris. We should be trying to predict human reaction to the market." Her new model, which she had tentatively named Cassandra, didn't just look at market data. It ingested global news feeds, social media sentiment, and even the linguistic patterns of regulatory announcements. It was designed not to avoid risk, but to understand it on a deeper, more fundamental level. It didn't assume rationality. It assumed panic and built its defenses accordingly. It was a breakthrough. It was the evolution they had been searching for. Julian stared at the board, his mathematician's mind racing to grasp the elegant, paradigm-shifting genius of it. He looked from the whiteboard to Clara. He saw the fire in her grey eyes, the fierce, brilliant light that had been hidden for so long. He had offered her a job to repay a debt. He realized now he had done more than that. He hadn't just saved her from a dead-end life. He had unleashed a force of nature. 2 years passed, not in a blur, but as a series of sharp, vivid victories. The Cassandra system, after a year of rigorous, transparent testing with Alistair Finch's own team, had gone live. The joint venture was funded not with 200 million, but with 500. It became the gold standard for risk management, its performance so steady and reliable in a volatile world that it changed the industry. Clara Reed was no longer a company legend. She was a financial celebrity. She had been profiled in the Wall Street Journal, an article that tactfully described her as a formerly independent researcher. She used her wealth and influence to establish the Reed Foundation, a non-profit that paid the medical debts of families who had been forced to sacrifice their education and careers to care for sick loved ones. One crisp autumn evening, Julian Croft invited her to dinner. He didn't say where. When the car pulled up, Clara felt a strange jolt, a phantom memory. It was the Obsidian Club. The maitre d', a new man she didn't recognize, greeted Julian by name and led them not to the main dining room, but directly to the sovereign room. The table was set for 2, in the exact spot where her life had been shattered and remade. As she sat down, she saw Mr. Gable at the far end of the restaurant. He was no longer the manager. He was a senior waiter, his posture stooped, his face etched with a permanent, weary resentment. He saw her, and his eyes widened in a flash of disbelief and something that looked like fear before he quickly turned away, busying himself with a wine bucket. There was no triumph in it for Clara, only a quiet, melancholy acknowledgement of how far she had come. "I thought it was time we created a new memory in this room," Julian said gently. During dinner, they didn't talk about quarterly earnings or alpha decay. They talked about the future. Clara spoke passionately about her new project, using the Cassandra framework to model climate change's impact on global supply chains. "You know," Julian said, swirling a glass of wine, "not a Petrus, but a more modest, excellent vintage. I still have it." "Have what?" Clara asked. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound frame. Inside, behind museum-quality glass, was the original sommelier's tasting card. Her frantic, powerful script was perfectly preserved. "I keep it on my desk," he said. "Whenever a new quant tells me his model is a sure thing, or a consultant guarantees a result, I look at this. It reminds me that certainty is the enemy of truth. It reminds me that the most important person in any room might be the one you're trained to ignore." Clara looked at the artifact of her old life, a testament to her single moment of impossible courage. She was no longer that desperate waitress, nor was she only the brilliant analyst. She was both. She was a woman forged in the crucible of hardship, who had reclaimed her own genius. Looking at Julian across the table, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile of a person who was, at long last, completely and utterly whole. The whisper in the dark had not just saved an empire, it had led her into the light, and her new beginning had become her legacy.